And we're introduced to Joseph, and he's 17 years of age. So we don't know much, if anything, about him. He's suddenly a sort of young adult, and he's a favorite child of his father, Jacob. He's a dreamer of dreams. He liked to have a few dreams, did Joseph. And he was the son of Jacob's favorite wife. And who was that? It was Rachel, okay? So he was the son of Rachel. She had another son, Benjamin. Excellent. Chapter 35, verses 16 to 18. We're told that Rachel, this wife who Jacob loved best, labored in child. And it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, you will have this son." And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Joseph had a brother by this same wife, Rachel, only the two of them. And when Joseph was 17, he'd have been maybe 3-ish or so, just a little baby or infant or toddler. And that's going to be important later on in the story, okay? The relationship between those two. Now then, I'm quickly going to summarize what we saw, and maybe you want to jot down a smiley face or a sad face, depending on how you think he felt at the time, all right? So we're introduced to Joseph in chapter 37, age 17, loved by his dad, coat of many colors. Wow, life is great, yeah? He goes to see his brothers. First thing that happens, sold by his brothers, thrown into a pit and sold. Now, that good point in his life or a bad point? Anyway, they drag him out of the pit. They sell him to a group of Ishmaelites walking past, and he goes down into Egypt in chains. So again, was that a happy or a sad event in his life? But we saw, because he worked hard when he was there in the house of Potiphar, he was promoted pretty quickly and was put in charge of everything that Potiphar had. So life looked like it was on the up again. And then he was accused of a crime he didn't commit by Potiphar's wife. Just as life was getting back on its feet for him, he was thrown into prison. But when he was in prison, because he worked so hard, he was promoted. He had if we can call it that, an easy life. So things are on the up again for Joseph. And while he was in prison, he met two people who dreamed a couple of dreams. And who were they? Hands in the air. Caleb, butler and the baker. And he helped them out. And he said, "This is it now. They're going to remember me." He says, "Remember me when you're out of prison." He says that to one of them anyway. The other one didn't quite make it. But to the other one, he says, "Remember me." And he's thinking, this is it. I'm going to get out of here. But they didn't. They forgot him. 2 years went by. Was that a happy event in his life? Was that a sad event in his life? But then Pharaoh dreams a dream and kickstarts, was it the butler or the baker, the one that was left alive? It was the baker. Any advance on that? Michael, the butler. It was the butler who was left alive. And Pharaoh has a dream, and he suddenly thinks, do you know what? I know this guy in prison. So Pharaoh gets him out of prison, he interprets his dream, and suddenly becomes second in the land, only unto Pharaoh. So a happy event in his life. So as we go through his life, see why this is relevant. Sometimes, as it is in our lives, I suppose, we don't know what's going on, basically. We go through good times, we go through bad times. It goes good again, it goes bad again, it goes good again. But Joseph never lost his faith, as we're going to see. I'm going to see quite why he did that in a second. Now then, these events from when Joseph was 17, when we meet him, to when he was second in command to Pharaoh, would anyone like to hazard a guess as to how long a period of time has passed? before you do, it's a couple of chapters, isn't it? We read it in 5-10 minutes, basically, and it's like, oh yeah, Joseph was a little boy, now he's second in command. How long had gone between those 2 points? How many? 40, not quite 40. I reckon Moses, 2 years is quite a long time, isn't it? And he's a pretty long time. It wasn't 2 years. It's about 22 years, all right. So we read it, and we read it as if it's happening, bang, bang, bang. It's not. 22 years. Takes a couple of minutes to read. And sometimes we don't step back and think, well, how, if I was Joseph, how would this have affected me? 22 years, and I'm thinking, sometimes life is terrible for me. Sometimes life is good for me. What would have been going through his mind? 22 years before God sort of finally revealed himself. Now then, we also looked at two key principles. I was here, so I know that John told you to mark them up. What were the two key principles from the first half of Joseph's life? I'm going to give you a clue. The first was in chapter 39. I mean, it should be easy. You turn your page over and they'll all be highlighted, right? Key principle. First part of Joseph's life. How did he get through it all? Excellent. Well done, Auntie Rishmael. The Lord was with him. Okay, I didn't hear many of you say that, so perhaps you didn't highlight them. Second chance. Chapter 39, verse 2. Yep. Perfect. Let's. Yep. Brilliant. Okay, so verse 2, verse 3, verse 5, verse 20, verse 23, okay? The Lord was with Joseph. That's a key principle in his life. The second, we looked at somebody, or we looked at Joseph, and we said, well, who is he like? Okay? Who did we particularly try and find out who Joseph was like? Lord Jesus Christ, okay? Can anyone give me some examples? Just a couple. Oh, sold for money. Excellent. Any others? Oof. Go, Jonah. Accused falsely. Brilliant. So time and again, I think John put up a slide, didn't he? Lots and lots of types of Christ in Joseph's life. So key lessons to take away from the first section we looked at. It applies to us, yes. God works with Joseph. He'll work with us if we put our trust in him. And Joseph was acting as a type of Christ, all right? And so in our lives, when we try and live through the good times and through the bad times, we've got to think about, although we're not being types of Christ, we're now trying to pretend to be Christ. So to live our lives as Christ would have lived his. So the overriding theme throughout his whole life, through all these chapters now, is that God is working behind the scenes. And once we've been through these, we'll be sort of jumping back and forth a bit. Probably worth in your own time when you go home or whatever, going back to the very beginning, Genesis 37, and just carefully reading the whole of the story all over again, okay? So when you've got to the end and you know story and you know some of the details, go all the way back to the beginning and then read it through that pair of eyes. It's definitely worth doing. It's a real exciting story. Okay, so we come into chapter 41. We need to imagine ourselves in Egypt now, okay? We've seen the Mummy and Tomb Raider or whatever it might be. We know enough about Egypt, don't we? The pyramids, the Sphinx, sand and gold and things like that. This is where Joseph would have been living. In chapter 41, coming out of prison to interpret two dreams that were had by Pharaoh. Now, those two dreams were what? Cows and the wheat. And how many of them? 7 fat cows, 7 thin cows, 7 fat sheaves, if you call them that, 7 thin sheaves. It's not quite the right description. But anyway, Joseph is called to interpret these dreams. And what does he interpret them as? What does it mean? What do these dreams mean? Good food, brilliant. So he says to Pharaoh, right, 7 years of good times are coming. They're going to be followed by 7 years of bad time. Pharaoh says, well, okay, in that case, verse 35 of chapter 41, Joseph, you're in charge of this now. Gather up all the food of those good years, lay up the corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. So, thankfully, they're forewarned about this famine that was coming, all right? Joseph is put in charge, collecting all this food. Now, you probably know, certainly heard of Egypt, definitely heard of the Nile. So this is an aerial view, and basically every year, without fail, the Nile floods its banks and sort of fertilizes the floodplain to the side. And so from there to there, beautiful for growing your crops, and bang, you're straight into the desert. But it's fine because every year it happens, okay? Time after time, getting crops every year. So in the normal course of events, you wouldn't be storing up anything because you know next year it's going to be just as good as it was this year, all right? However, the end of chapter 41, verse 53, let's have a read of that. Okay. The 7 years of plenteousness, verse 53, that was in the land of Egypt was ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the famine was in all lands. In the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, go unto Joseph, what he saith unto you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold into the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. All countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in the land. So, what is the word that is being emphasized? What is the word? No, not what is it. What's the word that's being emphasized in those verses? Famine, okay? If we missed it, verse 54, famine, famine. The people were famished. Verse 56, there was a famine, there was a famine. Verse 57, there was a famine. But this wasn't supposed to happen because every year the Nile flooded and everything was happy and rosy. Here's a slide, actually. It's not about the actual famine that happened, but periodically, I think it's one in a sort of 4,000-year event, they'd class it, but every now and again it wouldn't flood, and this is the sort of thing that would happen. So this is somewhere between 332 to 31 BC. There's this stone in Egypt, and they've written on it a record of a famine that happened. Like I say, it's not the same famine, though it did happen over 7 years. The king is upset and worried. The land has been in the grip of drought and famine for 7 years, during which time the Nile has not flooded the farmlands. Text also describes how the Egyptians are suffering as a result of the drought, and that they are desperate and breaking the laws of the land. So when something like this happened, it wasn't good. Pharaoh, or if he was a pharaoh then, that guy was worried. The people were looking around for food. They were starting to sort of get restless, and anarchy could have descended. Luckily, in Genesis, like we say, it wasn't luck, but you know what I mean. Joseph was on hand to store up enough corn that this wasn't going to be a problem. So, famine is the key word being stressed. I want you to turn to Psalm 105. So, to all intents and purposes, you know, this is just bad luck if you're living in it. 7 years of plenty, excellent. And then you're thinking, oh dear, there's famine all of a sudden? Was it just blind luck? Well, Psalm 105, verse 16. You might want to put this in your margin back in Genesis. It tells you a bit about this time. You'll have to decide where. Moreover, God called for a famine in the land. He destroyed all the provision of bread. So you see what is being emphasized in Genesis 41. There's a famine, there's a famine, there's a famine. It wasn't time and chance. This was absolutely being controlled by God. God called for a famine. Carries on in Psalms. He, God, sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. So that's another important thing we need to remember. God had a plan, okay? He sends this famine, but he's already sent a man called Joseph to be in the right place at the right time. So what's going to happen next can happen next. One more, just to show that God is absolutely in control. Acts chapter 7, so in the New Testament, page 1571. Again, another commentary on this sort of time, just emphasizing God is working behind the scenes here. Verse 9 of Acts chapter 7. The patriarchs, that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. No, it's not, sorry, it's the 12 brothers. Being envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. So we've done that already in part 1. But God was with him. We've marked that up in part 1 and tonight, if you didn't. And delivered him out of all his trouble and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He made him governor over Egypt and all his house. God is doing all of this. Now a famine and great trouble came over the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. So you see what God is doing here, laying the foundation. He sends a famine, which is a terrible famine. But he's already sent Joseph to be in the right place at the right time. And what he's going to do next, according to Acts, is send Jacob and the 12 brothers. So we come into Genesis chapter 42. We're going to have to read a few verses as we go through this. So bear with us. We'll see how far we get through. Eh? So Genesis 42. Try and put ourselves in the picture here, okay? Now, when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, why are you looking at one another? I've heard that there's corn in Egypt. Get down thither and buy for us from there, that we may live and not die. So it's this serious, okay? If they didn't go down, they would be dying. Joseph's 10 brethren, verse 3, went down to buy corn in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob sent not with his brethren, for he said, lest mischief befall him. So, why didn't Jacob send Benjamin? No. He'd be staying on his own. All the 10 brethren would be leaving their families behind, leaving their houses behind. But Jacob says, but Benjamin, he's not going with you. Why not? Hands in the air. Go, Ruth. Okay, we've already looked at that, haven't we? Yeah. So he's the other son of Rachel. He thinks Joseph is dead. He was his favorite son. Now his favorite son is Benjamin. And so he's thinking, well, do I really want to risk him? But he doesn't just say that. What does he say in the end of verse 4? What word there? Moses, you'll probably get up to this all the time. The word mischief. Genesis 42, verse 4. Lest peradventure mischief befall him. And that gives us a bit of a clue, I think, that Jacob wasn't entirely happy with the story that he'd been told about what happened to Joseph. Or he certainly put the blame, even if he did think Joseph was dead, fairly and squarely with his brothers. They caused the mischief. Let's have a look at verse 38. This is something that 22 years later, okay, still in his head, going round and round. And he's thinking, this doesn't add up, not at all. Verse 38, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone, if mischief befall him. So he likes that word, mischief. Chapter 44, verse 29. If you take this also from me, Benjamin, and mischief befall him, you shall bring down my grey hairs with sorrow to the grave. So he didn't know at this point what had really happened. But 22 years later, still wasn't willing to give those sons the benefit of the doubt. And as Benjamin was now his next most beloved son, he said, it's not going with you. But nevertheless, these guys have gone down to see Joseph. And Joseph was going to test whether or not his brothers had changed. You reckon his brothers had changed? Yes. You don't know? Maybe. You think they'd change? Okay. Well, we're going to see. That's what Joseph was trying to do. Find out if they had. So verse 5, the sons of Israel, these 10 brothers, come to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was great, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. So you can imagine Joseph would have been on tender hooks whenever it was said, right, there's another group that have come from Canaan. They've come to buy some food. He'd have rushed in there and he'd have looked at them and they'd have been like, oh, this isn't them. Never mind. Wait for the next ones. Wait for the next one. Joseph was the governor over the land. He it was that sold to all the people of the land. In actual fact, in chapter 41, verse 55, this is another example of God's providence in action. It wasn't his choice, actually, to be the go-to God, necessarily. Pharaoh said to the Egyptians when they came to him, he was probably like, oh, whatever, just go and see Joseph. Whatever he says to you, just do what he says. And so a throwaway comment by Pharaoh maybe puts Joseph providentially as the guy that everybody would come past when they came into Egypt. So Joseph's brethren came, verse 6, bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. So, question, what does that remind us of? Genesis 37. So let's turn there and let's pop it in our margin if it isn't there, because this is incredible, you know. Like I say, 22 years later, these 10 people come in front of Joseph. First thing they do, they don't say hello or anything like that, bow themselves on their faces to the earth. The fulfillment of Genesis 37, verse 7. We'll say a fulfillment. It might have actually only been a partial fulfillment. Let's not get too bogged down. Instead, just to show how important it was, chapter 43, verse 26. How many times do you reckon the brothers bowed down to Joseph? 5 times these brothers bow down to him. God is absolutely going to fulfill his promises. Well, so like I said, they've got no idea what's going on here. Joseph saw his brethren, verse 7, and he knew them, but he made himself strange unto them and spake roughly unto them. He doesn't want to give the game away. And he says, where have you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew him not. So why might Joseph have known? How would he have recognized them? That's the first question. Why would he have said, these guys, they're my brothers? Yep, we're not there yet. We're in chapter 42, verse 8. So Joseph recognizes his brothers. 10 of them come from the land where he used to live. Rough-looking shepherds, he'd have recognized them, wouldn't he? Thought they wouldn't have changed much. Himself, on the other hand, would have changed dramatically since they saw him. I mean, when I look at myself, 22 years I am now, after I was 17, unrecognizable I am. Does that remind us of another type of Christ? He recognizes his brethren. His brethren knew him not, it says the word is. They knew him not. Lord Jesus Christ, absolutely. Maybe just note it in your margin as time is marching on. John chapter 1, verse 10. He came unto his brethren and they knew him not. I think it says that, something like that. But nevertheless, they didn't know when Jesus appeared to them. Okay, so Joseph remembered the dream, verse 9, thinking, well, yeah, this is a fulfillment of that. That's brilliant. But he wants to see how this plays out. So he says, no, you're spies. You've come to see the nakedness of the land. They say, no, we've come to buy food. We are all one man's son. We are true men. Thy servants are no spies. So, what are the brothers saying to this man who they don't know who he is? He's saying, you're spies. They say to him, what? We are what? We are true men, okay? You've got us wrong. Call him Joseph, they wouldn't have. You've got us wrong, Joseph. We're not spies. We're good men. We're true men. Joseph would have thought, well, you're talking to the wrong person about that, because you were the ones who threw me in a pit and sold me into slavery. He didn't think like that because he was nice. But just notice now, as we go through the chapter, that he determines to find out. He desperately wants them to be good, true men, but he needs to find out if they are. So true men, okay, get your colors out. Verse 11, we are true men. Verse 16, he's trying to see if there's any truth in you. Verse 19, if ye be true men. Verse 31, we are true men. Verse 33, I know that hereby shall I know that you are true men. Verse 34, but that ye are true men. So he's hammering this point home, isn't he? Are my brothers, have they changed? Are they true men? I need to find out. Well, in their haste to answer the question, you're spies, they're like, no, we're not. What we are is, verse 13, 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is not. What they've done in their haste, unbeknownst to them, is let slip. Again, I say that tongue in cheek because Joseph obviously knew all of this, but they've let slip that more than they should have. We're 12 brothers, one we've left at home, and the other one, well, he's dead. Joseph pounces on it. Verse 14, aha, right then. This is what I spake unto you, saying, you are spies. I'm going to pick up what you've just said, and I'm going to prove whether this is true or not. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from here except your youngest brother, who they've just mentioned by accident, come hither. Send one of you, and let him fetch your brother, and the rest of you will be kept in prison, that your words may be proved, whether there be any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh you are spies. Put them all together in ward 3 days. Joseph said unto them the third day, this do and live, for I fear God. Actually, shouldn't have read that one. So we've just gone to verse 17. So what he says to them is he says, okay, I'm going to test your little comment that you've made there. And to prove it, one of you is going to go back home and fetch that brother and bring him back. And the rest of you are going to be put in prison. And then he puts them all in prison for 3 days while they choose which one of them is going to go back. Now then, what's the potential problem here? Which of those brothers would you trust? Come on, I put you in prison. I'm going to kill you all unless you've got to pick one of you, and he's going. Which one? Come on. Oh no, Joseph's the one picking. Can you imagine what those brothers will be thinking? 3 days, and they've got to look at each other and they've got to say, if you go, you ain't coming back. I know that. You'll be gone. And they look at the next one and say, yeah, if you go, you ain't coming back. Then what are we going to do? This guy is saying, one of you has to go or you're all going to die. Problem is, none of them trusted any of them to go. So they're in a bit of a pickle. They'd have been stewing about that. But like I say, Joseph wasn't nasty. So verse 19, he changes the rules, actually. But before we get there, what do you think they were talking about when they were in the prison? 3 days. What they'd done to Joseph. That's right. Verse 21 to 23 tells us. It comes after, but it's slotted in. Read. So he chucks them into prison for 3 days. They're thinking, oh, no, we've got to pick one of us to go. We don't trust any of us. We're in a right pickle here. They said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, that we saw the anguish of his soul, and he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. Why on earth would they have linked being put in prison with what they did to their brother 20 years ago? No reason to link it, except if for all that time they'd had a guilty conscience. I think they had. So now they're saying, we're so sorry for what we've done. We saw how distressed he was. Now look what's happening to us. Reuben carries on, verse 22. Didn't I say, don't sin against the child? But ye would not hear. Therefore, behold, his blood is required. They didn't know, of course, verse 23, that Joseph understood them because he was pretending that he only spoke Egyptian. You know what? That's the first time that Joseph would have heard Reuben saying, I tried to stop you guys. I said, don't sin against the child, and you wouldn't hear. Now, what emotion about this event do you think Joseph was feeling the most? Do you think he was angry with his brothers? Do you think he was, bitter with what they'd done and looking for a chance to get them back? You'd have been real angry, wouldn't you? Really angry. Joseph wasn't, though. We'll come to that when he does reveal himself to them. But at the moment, he's keeping it secret because he's trying to test if they really are good men or not. Anyway, he turns from them and he weeps when he hears Reuben saying that I told you that you were supposed to save Joseph, not sell him. He was not angry with them. He was really sad about what had happened. In fact, as we go through, we won't do it now, that word wept comes up 7 times. He was a man who sort of cared for other people. He didn't like to see his brothers in this state. It was emotional for him. So being a nice guy rather than like me, verse 19 now, he says, okay, 3 days are up. If ye be true men, let one of your brethren be bound in the house of your prison. Go ye, carry corn for the famine of your houses. So what's he changed? Careful Bible reading. What's he saying in verse 16 compared to what he says in verse 19? Solve their problem for them. Okay, so that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to shepherd these guys back. But before he does that, you remember we said, send one of you in verse 16, and that would mean 11 or 9 would have to stay behind wondering if they'd ever see him again. He's changed that in verse 19. He's now saying, actually, only one of you has to go. Only one of you has to stay. The rest of you can go. So he's made their problem easier. That's a very good point. They'd all left their families. That's an excellent point, actually. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. But they all had families and children back at home. So he was being very nice. Okay, so puts the money in their sacks. To summarize the rest of this. As they're going home, they find the money in their sacks and they're pretty frightened about this. They get to their father, they tell their father towards the end of the chapter everything that had happened. And Jacob is a little bit distressed by what he hears. And he ends verse 38 with a sort of flat out refusal. That they're saying, we've got to go back again. He says, you know, my son will not go down with you. His brother is dead. He's left alone. If mischief befall him by the way in which ye go, then he shall bring down my grey hairs with sorrow to the grave. So sorry for the guy you left behind. Who was it? Simeon. The rest of you aren't going back with this boy. Simeon's gone. That's it, he said. Well, he said that when he had lots of food on his plate, because that's the end of visit 1. We come into visit 2 now, which is chapter 43 to 45. And it tells us the famine was sore in the land. And it came to pass when they had eaten up the corn which they had brought out of Egypt, that their father said unto them, go again, buy us a little food. So he was pretty adamant at the start, you're not going. Now his food's run out. He's thinking, well, okay, maybe you're going to have to. How long after do you reckon this was, just out of interest? How long did that food last? How long was Simeon in prison for? That time. 2 months? 2 years? 10 years? 3 years? I reckon it's about 9 months. They had enough food to last them for about 9 months. 9 months has gone by now, or so. They've run out of food. Jacob has sort of started to give in a bit, and he said, okay, right, you're going to have to go down and get some more food. Judah said unto him, well, the man did solemnly protest unto us, saying, you shall not see my face, except your brother be with you. Is that what he said to them? Not actually. Chapter 42, verse 20, he says, if you come back without your brother, you're all dead. So Judah softened it a bit there. He said, we won't see his face. Actually, he'd said, we're all going to die. Interestingly enough, verse 3, for those of you who like this sort of thing, the man did solemnly protest. Well, that's actually the same word in the original language. It said the man, Joseph, protested, saying, you've got to bring your brother with you. Now, we know the end of the story. And he was saying that, not like the brothers would have seen what he was trying to do, but basically he was saying, almost without telling them, I know about you, you have to bring your brother. You have to bring your brother. Okay, he's emphasizing that. Thou wilt send our brother with us, we will go down and buy food. But if thou wilt not send him, we will not go, because he says, you're not going to see our face unless you do. And Israel said, why did you deal so ill with me as to tell the man whether you had a brother? So, I said earlier on that in their haste to say they weren't spies, they let slip that they had a brother. Well, it's all sort of fallen on their head, and now they can't go back without their brother. And Jacob saying, why did you tell them that you had a brother? Verse 7, they said, the man, who we know as Joseph, asked us straitly of our state. Again, just like verse 3, those are the same words. He asked and asked of our state and of our kindred, saying, is your father yet alive? So I imagine if we were standing in the room, we'd have found it completely obvious that it was Joseph trying to understand what was going on with his family. Is your father alive? Is he alive? Are you sure he's alive? Are you absolutely sure you're alive? I'm going to ask you again. Are you sure he's alive? Time and time again, he was just saying it and saying it and saying it. He was desperate to know about his father and his brother. Almost impatient, I suppose, to get them back again. And he'd have to wait 9 months. Well, Judah now steps up. Father has said, you're not going down. Judah said, well, we have to go down because we're not going to see, his face without our brother. And now he takes the lead. In verses 8 to 10, he says, listen, I'm going to be in charge. If something happens, then take it out on me. I'll bear all the blame for anything that goes wrong. Just want to take you back to chapter, where are we going? 37, verse 26. Who do you think was the ringleader in the plot against Joseph? We know that Reuben was the good guy, if we can call him that. Why do you think it was Judah? Was I being unlike Joseph and making it too obvious? You're absolutely right. It was Judah. So, verse 26 of chapter 37, Judah said to his brethren, what profit is it that we slay our brother? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. So he hatched the plan. He was the ringleader here. But now, is he a true man? Are they true men? Have they changed? Well, he seems to have, doesn't he? He's saying, listen, I'm going to front up now. I'm going to take responsibility. If anything happens, it's my problem, my fault, which is a good thing for him to have done. And so they collect together a load of food and send them away to go down into Egypt. They take with them the money that they had to start with. They didn't want to be blamed for stealing from them, from Joseph and the rest of them. And they come the second time, and as we've seen, verse 26, bow themselves to the earth in front of him. I'm going to whip through this because we've not got much time now, but I'm sure you know the story. Joseph sets on a good meal for them. He arranges them in order of their age. Again, they fail to pick up on the obviousness to us of something strange going on here. They have a lovely time eating food and having a bit of a drink, and the night ends on a high. Okay, so these brothers are like, brilliant. We've done it. We've got here. We've proved we're not spies. Benjamin's with us. He's treating us really well. Life is brilliant. But then comes chapter 44, because Joseph has not yet finished trying to decide if these are changed men. So again, we know the story. He puts money in their sacks, but in the sack of one of them, Benjamin, he puts his precious golden cup. And as they're leaving, he chases after them, catches, or rather his servant chases after them and catches them. And where do we pick it up? Verse 9, I reckon. He's got them all off their donkeys now, lined up, naughty schoolboys, and he says, right, I'm going to go through each of your sacks now, seize what in it. They say, with whomsoever of thy servants it be found, this cup, both let him die, and we also will be my Lord's bondmen. So they're so confident that nothing has gone awry here. They said, well, whoever's got it, kill him and we'll be your servants. It's not us. We haven't stolen it. But the servant, he knew what was going on, of course, says, now also let it be according to your words. Tell you what, he with whom it is found shall be my servant, and the rest of you can be blameless. He knows who's got it, of course. Took down their sack, every man opened it up. He searched at the eldest, went down. They were thinking, I told you, none of us have got it. It's not in our sacks. So they got to Benjamin. Lo and behold, there was the cup. Absolutely right. But do you know what they could have done? What did that servant say to them? Did he say they all had to go back? Didn't, did he? He said, only one of you has to come back with me. The one who's stolen the cup can come back with me. So those brothers could have said, brilliant. 20 years ago, they would have. They'd have said, oh, sorry, Benjamin, it's your problem, we're off. They'd been given a chance to escape, and yet every one of them, verse 13, rent their clothes, laded every man his ass, returned to the city. These men, these guys, have changed, haven't they? They're given 3 opportunities, actually, to escape, to get out of this, and they don't take it on any of their occasions. Yeah, okay. Right, we're going to whip through. We've sort of run out of time. I want to just bring your attention to one thing in chapter 45. You can look through this. Like I said, read through the whole of the story in your own time. Chapter 45, Joseph has made himself known to his brothers. And there's another really important principle that is brought out here. We saw the Lord was with Joseph in chapter 39. You might want to note here, chapter 45, that Joseph didn't hold a grudge against his brothers at all. Instead, he says, verse 5, God did send me before you to preserve life. Okay, that was his feeling. God sent me. We saw that in Psalm 105. Verse 7, God sent me before you. Verse 8, it wasn't you, it was God. Go to my father and say, God hath made me Lord of Egypt. Okay, so that's a really important lesson we can take away and think about. Joseph never lost his faith that God was with him. And although he couldn't see it at the time, like we can't see it in our own lives much of the time, when he looked back, he could see absolutely God has done it in this instance to preserve life. Right, well, I want to wrap up because time is going on. And to do that, I just want to quickly go to chapter 50. I won't attempt to summarize all of the 8 seminars that we've been through, but you've been to all of them. You'd have remembered how we looked at the creation account in the very beginning of Genesis. We looked at Adam and Eve, how sin entered into the world. We looked at a promise that was given to the woman of a seed that would come. We looked at Abraham, the promises made to him about a land, about a seed, about blessings on his family, how they were passed down to Isaac and to Jacob. And these promises, well, they were things that were never far from Jacob's mind, and certainly never far from Joseph's mind. When Jacob was about to die, he said, you've got to take me back to the land of my fathers. I want to go back there. And Joseph did that for him. When Joseph dies in chapter 50, it says this. Well, let's go from verse 22. Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. Verse 24, Joseph said to his brethren, I die. God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. And they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And so with the purpose of Joseph complete, aged 56, we know nothing more about his life, even though he died at 110. Final words were, I want you to take me back to the land promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. You have to take my bones back, he says. Those are the only thing that he cared about in his life, actually, which was the hope of the life to come. And so when we come to the end of Genesis, he's fulfilled his task that God had given him, savior of the world, savior of his brothers. And we don't need to know anything more about the rest of the life of Joseph. But all of these characters that we'll have looked at over the 8 weeks have one thing in common. I'd like finally to go, well, not quite finally, but finally enough, to Hebrews chapter 11. This is where, it's not, well, it is a nice story. A lot of them are nice stories that we read about, but they're not just nice stories for us to read. They were real people. They lived real lives and went through real ups and downs in their life. But all those characters that we'd have looked at in the book of Genesis had one thing in common. Hebrews 11, chapter of faithful people, full of faithful people, and all the way up to verse 22, it tells us about people that are found in the book of Genesis. And it carries on with ones that come after. But all of these people, verse 13, had one thing, like I said, in common. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were persuaded of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. So what really mattered to all of these people wasn't the life that you can get now. It was the promise of a life that was still to come. For they that say such things, verse 14, declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So every one of these people that we can read about throughout the Bible, Genesis in particular, we've looked at, believed the promises that God had made to Abraham. They said, this life doesn't matter to us. We're looking for something better that is coming. And so God said, those are the people that I want to be able to say, they are my people. And they will say, he is my God. Chapter 11 ends. All these people, having obtained a good report through faith, so they lived faithful lives, received not the promise. Those bones of Joseph, they're still in his coffin, lying there. He's not received the promise that he invested his life in following. That's a good thing, actually. Verse 40, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. So you see, there'll come a day when God will say, right, enough's enough. Raise up Joseph, Abraham, all those faithful people, and the promises will be fulfilled. But until that time, we have a chance to be part of those promises, okay? So now I do want to finish in the final reference, which is Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3. So those promises, well, I can see, that they were made to Abraham, they were made to Isaac, they were made to Jacob. Joseph is related to Abraham, so, I can see how he's got a link there to those promises. But what about us? I'm no relation to Abraham at all. Galatians 3, verse 16. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not unto seeds as of many, but as of one, to thy seed, which is Christ. So yes, the promises were made to Abraham, but they were also made to his seed, Jesus Christ. Okay? Still, doesn't really affect me because I'm not related to Abraham. Saying this, in inverted commas, I'm not related to Christ. So the promises still don't relate to me. But now is our time of opportunity, all right? Verse 27. Because they can relate to us. For as many of you have been baptized into Christ, have put on Christ. So by being baptized, we become associated with Christ. Verse 29, and if you be Christ's, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So hopefully that will encourage you to sort of look at these things further, to act upon them. They're not just stories in the Bible. They're real people putting their trust in a real God who's giving them real promises. And if we are baptized, if we do something about the things that we've heard, then we too can become Abraham's seed and heirs according to those very same promises.